Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Thank you very much for joining us in this event about what's trade union identity and purpose in the 21st century. This is part of the conversations we are having for our online course in labor history, and particularly about the chapter, Why has labor organized? Looking back historically and trying to investigate such questions. We are very, very honored to have today with us two distinguished speakers. We have Richard Hyman, Emeritus Professor from the London School of Economics, the renowned Marxist academic at the heart of a coherent conceptual framework for a radical perspective on industrial relations. And with us is today also Baba Aye, Health and Social Sector Officer at the Public Services International, the Global Union, a prominent activist in the fights against military dictatorship in his home country, Nigeria, and wholeheartedly committed to building the trade union movement and radical and revolutionary social movements. Thank you very much for joining us, Richard and Baba, and thanks everyone for joining us. Before I start with the first question, may I please ask you to put the cameras on if that is possible? It is always nice to speak to faces instead of just looking at the black boxes. So please do that if it's possible for your internet. And if you have questions, please do put those in the chat box. So perhaps we start directly with a question for Richard. Your book of 2001, Understanding European Trade Unionism Between Market, Class and Society, has had an enormous influence on debates about the purpose and identity of trade unions, their evolution and future prospects. At the very start of this important book, you write, in different national contexts and historical periods, trade unions may be seen by their own members and officials and by outsiders as primarily as economic agents engaged in collective bargaining over terms and conditions of employment, or as fighting organizations confronting employers in a struggle between hostile classes, or as components of the fabric of social order. In some times and places, you say, they may be perceived in all disguises simultaneously. Fast forward to 2025. How would the framework of this analysis apply to the state of trade union identity and purpose today?
Yeah, thank you. I would say, I think, first of all, as someone who is a trade unionist and an activist, but also an academic, I try to make sense of what is going on, because unless we understand, we can't act effectively. And anyone looking at trade unions, I think, has to be struck by their complexity. And one of the things I try to do is to simplify. And when you simplify, you oversimplify. And that is the dilemma for understanding, and no one can get around it. But I try to ask the question, why, although we have trade unions in every country, why are they so different in what people are trying to do and how they go about it? And I asked three questions, what I call the who, the what, and the how. Who do trade unions try to recruit and represent? And again, one of the clear differences, both across countries and also within countries, is whether trade unions, and let me say, when I say trade unions, one shouldn't try to talk of trade unions as if they're people with a sort of single perception and a mode of action. Trade unions are organizations within which there are many different people with many different interests and very different perspectives. And trade unions in many ways are an arena of struggle in which people contest what the trade union is and what it should be doing. And I think we have to take that into account. But having said that, three questions. The who do trade unions represent? Some trade unions have a very narrow conception of who their constituents are. And because nowhere do we have the model of the one big union. Unions are in different shapes and forms in any country, and some represent people with particular occupations, particular skills. Some focus on particular industries, some focus on the public sector, some on the private sector. But how the constituency is defined to some extent shapes the capacity for action and the primary objectives. The what do trade unions try to represent? And in some countries, traditionally, the understanding has been rather narrow. It's wages and immediate conditions of work, the situation with the individual employer. In others, it's much broader. It's the whole status of workers within a society. And this then figures into one of the themes of this course, the whole question of trade unions and democracy. Do trade unions see themselves as agents for democratization of society in general, rather than simply winning better than wages and conditions in the individual workplace? And the third question, how do they go about it? And again, simplifying very much, do they try to get it mainly by negotiation, concession, compromise, getting the best deal they can within the existing institutions, or do they actually try to challenge the existing structure of society? And it seemed to me, looking simply within the framework of Western Europe, which is the context I know best, one is struck by the great variations. And clearly, if one looks at the world much more generally, the diversity is even greater. People used to talk in very simple terms about, on the one hand, business unionism, represented, I suppose, above all by the United States, where the primary focus is negotiating with the employer over wages and conditions. People talked, as Marx and Engels did, of unions as agencies of class struggle. Subsequently, when, in particular, Christian trade unions emerged, they saw trade unions as a way of integrating workers within the framework of society. And as social democracy, as once conceived as a revolutionary movement, turned into a very different kind of politics. So social democratic trade unions tended to embrace much of the same perspective and saw trade unions, above all, in the language of the European Union, as social partners. And what I came up with in my 2001 book, and as I say, it's a simplification, but some people found it useful, was that one might conceive of a triangle in which trade unions orient, on the one hand, to market negotiating within the labour market over wages and conditions. Second point of the triangle, towards class, seeing above all else the conflict of interest between labour and capital. And thirdly, orienting to a more complex idea of society as something composed of a complex of institutions and actors and trying to win labour a status within that. And it seemed to me, looking at experience in a number of European countries, that most unions historically developed an identity looking at primarily at 2 points in the triangle and the relationship between them, and developed their own understanding of what the union was, what its primary purpose was, and how it should achieve this in terms of one particular side of the triangle. And I looked at Britain, Italy, and Germany and tried to suggest how each of them took a different perspective. And I also argued that if one looked over time, particularly as circumstances became more difficult, as trade unions faced increasing challenges, which made it difficult to perform the functions which they'd previously seen as central. So they got pulled within the geometry of this triangle. And often there was increasing conflict within the unions, increasingly uncertainty as to what the unions really should be doing. And one could make sense of developments in the different countries in terms of the contradictions and tensions within this triangle. Now, I think it's not for me to say whether that is still an appropriate model and how far it's ever applied across the whole globe. That's something for you to tell me in our discussion. But it seems to me the idea of this tension between these three poles of a triangle is still relevant. It still helps making sense. And the conclusion I came up with, which was that increasingly the tensions between these 3 points, market, class, and society, still shape many of the dilemmas, many of the choices that have to be made, many of the strategic decisions. I think, as I see it, that's still relevant, but I'll be very glad to hear what you think.
Thank you very much, Richard. Yes, so let's move then to Baba to see what Baba thinks. Baba, by now you have spent most of your life in the labor movement. How do the arguments of Hyman of over 20 years ago resonate with your experience in the labor movement? What would be your reflections?
Thank you very much, Edlira, and thanks, Richard, for the book and for the discussion now. And there's something you said which I think is very important, and which is that, look, a lot of this is like simplifying things to be clearer, and these go with assumptions. And for example, if I'm talking of the trade unions, I would say you don't only have a multiplicity of it. I try to look at things more like talking of the trade union movement, and I'll speak to this and the different components which are in contention, and how this evolve as a movement, and the interfacing with markets, society. And I think there's well, it could be taken within the rubric of society, but I would also say there's the important place of the states. And of course, there's the point of departure of the conjuncture of the current situation, in which the current global dynamics shape things. For example, if you talk about, say, the American trade union system and the trade union movement, business union, it wasn't always like this. Very few today cast their minds back to the fact that you had, very vibrant left traditions in the trade union movement of the United States. It did not just happened that the more moderate form, there were pressures from state, there were, so a number of these, it's good to have this, take it from a point of departure of understanding the totality. So with that, I would start with looking at the trade unions itself. What are the components of what then constitutes this movement, and how does it fit in with the other aspects and relating to where we are now and the experiences one has had in Nigeria, across Africa, and globally. I'll say it is very useful to situate the place of the rank and file workers, the trade union bureaucracy, when looking at the trade unions and the trade union movement. And it's also very, very instructive to appreciate the two primary forms of power of the movement, so to speak. I would say the associative power, which comes from organizing, is most fundamental. But part of what you see is that the institutional power, which was one itself with associative power, has become much more important for the trade union bureaucracy, because it is this institutional power that enables collective bargaining. This institutional power is derived from things like the international labor covenants, national labor laws, and all that, and which were won through struggle or in an attempt to subvert the deepening of struggle. One of the things I love most in an earlier GLUE online course was where it spoke to the emergence of the ILO as an attempt, amongst other things, of course, to take the wind from the sails of the revolutionary movement in at the twilight of First World War, which included, the Russian Revolution, which included, the wave of the revolution in Germany, the wave of strikes and all that. So, I mean, not that the online academy used those exact words, but you get the idea. Was like the 8-hour day was granted, trying to stop the worst of hardship for workers to dampen more revolutionary ardor. So also similar to what Ken Loach described as the spirit of 45. I can't remember who in the House of Lords was saying before that, look, if you don't give them reforms, they'll give you revolution. So it was these associative powers, this that enabled the institutional power to bargain and all that, which primarily benefited and still benefits the trade union bureaucracy. And the trade union bureaucracy got stronger in the post-World War II order. And I mean, talking of the social compromise, which also enabled, particularly in the West, the almost full employment, the introduction of welfare, the welfare state, and employment benefit, and things like that. So you had. And then even in the global South, I mean, you had state interventionism, and Brazil. There was after Getúlio Vargas and all that, but it constructed some form of welfare state too in Africa, where you had the last continent for decolonization. The trade unions also played very, very fundamental roles in the decolonization struggle, which contributed to the respect in most states, in most countries that they had, in some places also then working with the ruling party. All this contributed to shaping the identity and priorities of the leadership of organized labor, the bureaucracy of the trade union movement, but as well too, because I think it's also important to stress this. We do have, like in Nigeria, on the left in Nigeria, this debate, oh, the trade union leadership are, reformist, they are, stopping strikes, and despite the fact that you have had over a dozen general strikes this century. I can't think of any other country where you've had that. But the thing is, when the strike gets to almost revolutionary extent, they are called off. And there was a particular time when the trade union leadership called off a strike before it was done. And they made it clear that was because they felt it could be taken beyond just economic demands. Anyway, is that it's not just about the trade union bureaucracy, it's about the hegemony. And this is where the issue, when Richard talks of society, the issue of how the ruling class, of course, they say the dominant ideas are generally the ideas of the dominant class. How the hegemony of people not seeing a possibility of something beyond what is now, beyond reforms. Let me put it in perspective with something I did say some time back and tie it to this. You remember 2010, our panel at the GLUE conference on post-capitalist alternatives. And what shocked me after 2000, after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, like a lot of people, when the Lehman Brothers, we expected with the mass upsurge of working class struggle that the trade unions would take things forward. But the trade unions did not go as far with their demands as the trade unions did in the wake of the Great Depression, and that contributed significantly to how and why the ruling class could get away with insisting that the remedy was more of what got the world sick in the first place. So you had more of neoliberalism instead of a new order like what came out after World War II as a social compromise. And the reason is largely because the trade union bureaucracy had gotten much more comfortable with what is now. So I would say it did not just happen. There was the conscious utilizing the state. There was conscious hegemonizing by the capitalists, by the ruling class globally and in different countries in different ways. And this took the wind from the sails of the movement. But it is also very, very encouraging when you see, as in Wisconsin, as with nurses in Nigeria, you see rank and file workers stepping forward, even at times against the dictates of the bureaucracy of the movement.
Thank you very much, Baba, for that response. I don't know, Richard, whether you want to have a quick response to that or a reflection to that, and then we are opening for questions from the participants.
Okay, very quick. I agree with most, at least what Baba says. And since you're a trade union bureaucrat, you obviously know the terrain. I come from a political tradition where people talked a lot about trade union bureaucracy. And I increasingly felt that things were a bit more complicated than that. And that in many ways, bureaucracy was built into the way in which trade unions functioned. And so if you look, for example, at the shop steward movement in Britain, which was extremely powerful and extremely rank and file based, it had its very strong internal bureaucratic tendencies. Because the nature of trade unionism is to look for stability in general. Antonio Gramsci, a century ago, talked about this. He talked about trade union legality. And he said getting rules of the game which in some ways are favourable to workers was an important achievement the great problem was when it was treated as the be-all and end-all and the furthest one could go. And I think this is the issue, that even if one establishes rules and procedures, can one envisage and organize for something more advanced and more progressive? And here, I think one of the great problems today is the extent to which the rank and file does not necessarily, when we talk of reform or revolution, some of the revolutionary changes that union rank and file are prepared to support are not necessarily the progressive ones that we would favour. A lot of the traditional trade union constituency in the United States supported Trump. A lot of them in Germany support the Alternative für Deutschland. There is, I'm being told to confirm my speaking language. These systems are very clever. The question of what people's consciousness is, what forms of social change they think is necessary and desirable, we can't simply assume there is a spontaneous rank and file commitment to some of the political objectives that we favour. That is a contest which has to be carried out, whatever the structure of trade unions, and not all trade union bureaucrats are, I think, opposed to some of the things that some of us in the rank and file also think is a good idea.
Thanks very much, Richard and Baba, for this initial thoughts and provocative thoughts. So it's open if somebody would like to have a question or a comment. You could either put it in the chat box or just raise your hand. I don't have a full view, but I suppose if somebody raises the hand, it'll come the first. While waiting for hands up, I don't see any yet, or anybody taking the microphone. We did have quite a few questions when people registered for this event. I would try to bring some of them. I think there was a question from Austin about looking back at the history, what led to the state of trade unions today. But I guess that's somehow answered by both your interventions. But if you want to have anything in particular to add to that, please do. But
Amida.
Baba, would you?
Yes, I could, and I also there's a hand up, Amida, which I wanted to, but quite quickly, what led to trade unions? I tried to capture that, but in response to Richard, I agree totally that things are much more complicated than bureaucracy rank and file, and I did speak to that earlier when I was pointing out that, contrary to the view on the Nigerian left that, oh, the problem is just with the trade union, organized labor leadership, remove them and it will be all rosy. No, it's much more complicated. Actually, in 2012, we had the largest strike in Nigeria's history. And you had this, I've posted something that I wrote in my blog a year later when this debate was sharpening. No, it's much more, there are limits to trade unionism. You know, a trade union movement is not a revolutionary party, so to speak. And because also if trade unions are unrepentantly, strictly revolution and just want to overthrow the system, I mean, what would be the basis for a capitalist employer getting into collective bargaining with them? You understand what I'm saying? Trade unionism inherently speaks to some acceptance of of capitalism as what it is, but it's about internal struggles within unions, within trade unions, even within the bureaucracy that that this comes out. And lastly, before I speak to that question, I see two hands up. I did say something in which is why I harp on the issue of the bureaucracy. That was 2004-5. I did raise at the NLC schools that look, you will the children of your general secretary or president of your union are more likely to attend the same school as the children of the CEO of your company or the permanent secretary of your ministry than the one that you, the rank and file, will go. I mean, it caused some rumpus with some unions saying that I was introducing subversive ideas within their union's rank and file. But that is the truth about it. In several places, the bureaucrats are they are not working class per se, even though they are part of the working class movement that the trade union is in so many ways. But regarding the question which you did say was posted, I say how the trade unions got to where they are now. It's a function of contention within the movement of the states. If like that was why I gave the example of the United States of parts of North America, because I mean even Canada is not part of. But anyway, and how it did not just happen. There were pressures and there also resistance from the movement, and then there's of course the changing economy. There are ideological, political, and material pressures in shaping how trade unions evolve in different specific contexts. Thank you. You are muted, Edlira.
Thanks. Thank you very much, Baba. Let me get Hamida first and then Joe.
Hi, comrades. My name is Hamida, as you can see, and I was the executive director of Naledi, which is the research arm of COSATU. I'm not there anymore, but I'm currently undertaking some work for Industrial in Zimbabwe and Zambia. And one of the key issues that we're trying to explore is the role of the trade union movement in the context of the just transition and this whole decarbonization economy. And so I was wondering whether there were any thoughts from our speakers and also for comrades on the group. You know, what are your thoughts in relation to the manner in which the trade union movement has or hasn't been able to advance the just transition? Because I think it epitomizes a whole lot of struggles that we're currently seeing, and maybe also speaks to the issue of either different forms of organizing or a reconfiguration based on how capital is reconfigured, globalization, global value chains, etc. So I'm quite open to hearing what our comrades have to say about that. Sorry for being long-winded. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Hamida. Shall we also take the question from Joe? Is that okay? Yeah, Joe, go ahead, please.
Good thing. Hi, and thanks so much for having me. Well, camera on. Hi, and Baba and I actually we met previously through the People's Vaccine Alliance a few years ago. So it's not lovely to see you again, Baba. And thank you for this interesting discussion. I just wanted to slightly respond to something that Professor Hyman you raised, the point about trade unionists in the United States, some sections of the constituency supporting Donald Trump, and likewise, and you know, with the AfD in Germany, and this tendency of traditional working class heartlands moving towards the far right. It's framed very much as a backlash to the prominence of liberal identity politics, and that poses a barrier to building working class solidarity. And I'm wondering how unions can overcome that perceived barrier that liberal identity politics is posing to working class solidarity without them throwing marginalized communities under the bus, because that is what the intention of that intersectional approach to politics is. But personally, I find it very. I'm stumped. I don't really know how to meet that impasse, and I really appreciate your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks very much. And perhaps just to add to the question of Hamida before, we had also a question with the registration coming from another comrade from South Africa, Devon. Are trade unions, as within the workplace, to perform a counter-hegemonic role in contemporary fossil capitalist society? So over to you on your thoughts on the questions. Who'd like to go first? Richard, would you go first?
Okay. I mean, two questions in some ways related. It seems to me if one looks at the level of official policies and national programs, trade union have in many, perhaps most countries, have shifted fairly radically over the last couple of decades, from being skeptical at best about the whole issue of climate change and adaptive policies to accepting the need for major changes in how societies organise their climate policies, how they react, how they need to reduce CO2 emissions. The problem, I think, is that by and large this has been a top-down process, and certainly union education policies and so on have taken this on board. Union journals, union websites, but not all that many union members necessarily take part in these courses, look at the websites, read the journals. And there's, I think it's increasingly clear, a very large disconnect between official union policies on this issue and the extent to which ordinary union members identify with the policies which unions embrace. And this becomes particularly a problem also when the traditional manual working class constituency of trade unions is often much less well unionized than, if you like, the new trade union constituency of public sector, white collar graduates, and the political divide we've seen in many countries in the last decade or so is that one of these groups is set very strongly in opposition to the other. And trade unions, I think, have not come up with a solution to this issue, and perhaps with sufficient recognition that this is a serious socio-political divide. And certainly, you know, if one looks at Germany, the AfD has made one of its main campaign slogans, "Yes to Diesel," and has managed to mobilize an awful lot of working class support against any serious efforts to mitigate and reverse climate change. Part of the problem, I think, is, you know, it goes back to some of the things that Baba was talking about, the whole ILO tripartite conception that you try to get effective regulation by getting unions, employers, and governments all agreeing with each other. And if you get this, then you get a lowest common denominator. And the idea of just transition may be accepted as a slogan, but there have been no serious attempts to make it a reality. And I think in the main, trade unions have not been willing to fight to make it a reality. And so they accept the marginal adaptation of climate mitigation policies, which still means that the working class, as well as being the main victims of climate change, are also those who are meant to pay the cost of transition. And it's perfectly understandable that if it's ordinary workers who are asked to make the sacrifices in an era of increasing hardship, they're not very happy about this. Bertolt Brecht used the famous line in the Three Opera, Erst kommt das Fressen, dann kommt die Moral. First you have to eat, then you could talk about morality. And unfortunately, the whole climate debate is afflicted by this issue, I think. Unless you show that workers ideally get an immediate improvement, but at the very least don't get an immediate deterioration in their circumstances, they're not going to buy into it. And it's simple as that. And I think the whole broader question of how one reacts to the far right is bound up with this. Unless you have credible policies that will actually improve people's situation, then the people who capitalize on this are the snake oil merchants, the political entrepreneurs who say it's someone else's fault. Don't listen to these left-wing progressives. We have simple answers. Vote for us and we'll put them through. And we're seeing this increasingly across the countries of the world.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, quickly, I think an important element to this discussion of the just transition, or a socio-ecological transition, is transition. It gets stuck in an assumption of not going beyond capitalism. But it is actually impossible without it being part of a sense of post-capitalist alternatives. And for me also, one of the things that I think, and these are practical, because when you look at it, it's not that people don't think, at least some don't, it's that people say, oh, these are big rocks, but they are small rocks. Can we face the small rocks? But the thing is this, I always point out that as way back as in the 30s, Keynes envisaged that by the year 2000, the work week would be 15 hours as against 40 hours, even on the basis of capitalism. Even on the basis of capitalism. But now, you see people even doing 2, 3, 4 jobs in trying to. So I think the trade union movement should, just like the role, what the 8-hour workday was then, demand something. And this is 25 years after, this is a quarter of a century after when Keynes had envisioned 15 hours. To demand that, look, the planet cannot continue like this. People should not work more than 15 hours a week and at no loss of pay. The problem is not lack of resources. I mean, see the way we are now talking of centi billionaires. The wealth is expanding. It's just that it's concentrated in a few hands. We need to be much more. We need to look at things. We need to insist that, to borrow from that word, which unfortunately died when I think it was most needed, another world is possible. That phrase, another world is possible. And related with regards to the issue of right-wing, right-wing ideas also finding soil within working class. It's part of this period of the morbid symptoms to draw from Gramsci. And this is where the issue of trade unions and left within the trade unions, within broader civil society, needs to, it's not, it's, we need to contend. We need to contend. It's not the liberal, and this is also part of why we need to challenge even the liberal identity, neoliberalism that gave the that helped those seeds to grow, because specifically social democratic, but some elements on the left accepting the framework of the neoliberal order, to draw from Tariq Ali, part of the extreme center, contributed to people not seeing other alternatives beyond radical, because these are also radical alternatives, just that they are radical right-wing alternatives. We need to not only dream dreams, but show with our arguments, show with struggle that, look, the radical left alternatives, another world is possible. We need something beyond capitalism. We can build a better world where people come before profit. Thank you.
Did any of you want to speak a bit more specifically to the question of Joe about the threats to the working class solidarity of the liberal identity politics?
Okay, the threat, I thought you spoke more on with regards to the seed of it. I think the issue of the threat, and very good. I will draw from what we as PSI are doing, and which is, you see, there has been fight back, and I'll start with the United States of parts of North America again, in light of, I mean, Trump, the Trumpesque, it's like the icing on the cake of increasing right-wing movement and ideas. But you have the trade unions like AFSMI, AFT. It's not accidental that public sector unions, for example, are on the front line of pushing back against this this growth of right-wing ideas and the hold on the working class. A number of those that are sucked into it, reality will make things clearer to them. For example, a number of those that voted Trump were shocked that even some of the DI thing, they will also impact on them. And people, a lot of working class people that get sucked into this, it's out of disillusionment. It's out of not seeing the. So we need the unions to not only posit alternatives, but to mobilize, carry out actions, strike actions, educate, political education, and I draw from PSI now on Monday, and I invite you as join. You can check this on. I'll share it also here now. The PSI and AFSMI we are having, and there will be series of such. So concrete action it's not going to be an easy thing, because unions have over the years helped to give the impression of that, look, we can only fight for a better nature of what exists as against fighting for something totally different from this. And all this have contributed to the spread of the consolidation because of such right-wing ideas and politics, because it's not the trade unions spreading this, but leaving such room in the absence of more radical alternative perspectives. More radical left alternative, because these are radical right perspectives.
Thank you, Baba. And Richard, would you like to add something on that question?
Yeah, in many ways it comes down to what I would term the exhaustion of the social democratic mode of politics. Social democracy was popular and effective when it had a credible vision of a better society, and in many countries could claim to have helped achieve this. For the last 30 years at least in those countries where social democracy has been strongest. Its position at best has been managing economic decline, managing the reversal of the shift of national income towards workers, managing the erosion of the welfare state, and increasingly adopting policies, and we see this in Britain at the moment, policies which are no better than those of the right wing, and in some respects even worse. If that's the alternative they offer, then not surprisingly, their traditional working class constituents are not particularly keen to support it, and they look for something different and more radical. And the fact that the radicalism is radicalism of the right, of billionaires posing as defenders of the ordinary worker, still means that they are seen as being different and perhaps promising something which they might achieve. Traditional left parties, in general, don't have a more convincing vision. And in the main, trade unions don't seem to have one either, and certainly don't seem to have come up with effective strategies for engaging with the very different and very dangerous socio-political situation that we're in at the moment.
Thanks very much, Richard. I have Peter raising his hand and two very interesting questions in the chat box, and we are towards an hour now. So perhaps we get Peter's question and then I get the other two questions, if that's okay with Richard and Baba, and then we try to respond to all of this. Peter, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to make a couple of quick remarks in response to various things that have been said here. We tend to talk about the labor movement, in this discussion at least, or we tend to talk about the unions as if the unions are the labor movement. And of course, the labor movement has always been much, much broader. There's never been a left without the unions, but unions have traditionally moved beyond a strict representation of their members' interests and onto a broader class perspective, and at times onto a more transformative perspective, alongside many other organizations of the working class, which in turn feed into the unions' members, the unions' forms of organization, union programs. There have been political parties, working class political parties, a working class press, and associated all kinds of working class forms of association outside the unions, which have been the environment in which, on the occasions when unions have gone beyond the necessary task, the task which gives them legitimacy, in fact, of representing their members and defending and advancing their members, to move on to a broader agenda. And as Richard and others have said, that is all gone today. So one of the problems is that the unions are operating in a desert, and that has important implications, both to explain the current situation and to help us think about how to get out of it. Richard mentioned, or Baba mentioned, I think, the financial meltdown of 2008. And one of the many things that was quite extraordinary about that is that the trade union movement as a whole had very little to say about it. There were no effective proposals or programs coming out of the trade union movement in response to that global crisis. nor suggestions about how to take steps in the future that might help to avoid similar crises. And of course, we're staring at a possible rerun of precisely that crisis. And that leads into the question of just transition. I think there are many problems with the concept, but one of them certainly, as you see it in the union discussion about it, is that it assumes the capital is somehow transitioning to a different energy regime, and the role of the trade unions is to simply bargain a piece of that and ensure that it doesn't fall disproportionately on their members and on the poorest and most vulnerable. And that is, of course, a laudable goal. But I think we have to ask, what kind of transition is capital actually organizing? And is it our task to actually shape the kind of investments and social policies that would result in serious decarbonization? Or is it a more passive one where we sit by and say, that's very good, the quotient of renewables has gone up, and let's see what the consequences have been? Because as a number of authors have recently pointed out very convincingly, the notion of energy transitions is actually quite ambiguous. We have a record increase in the use of renewable electrical sources at the same time today as we have record use of oil and coal. Virtually every week, a coal-fired power station comes online. So the question for the unions is not simply to wait for a transition, as they waited for some kind of transition, for example, in post-communist societies, a transition which went a different way than what was expected. The question is, how can unions actually, and the broader labor movement, actually shape the movement towards a carbon-free society? And that, I think, in my view, certainly, would suggest that we need a very different kind of labor movement. And finally, on the question of bureaucracy, exactly. I want to say that when we talk about the complexity of union structures and union bureaucracies, it's very important to remember what we call the union bureaucracy is actually a product of past working class conquests. It represents a layer of victory. And when those victories are eliminated or rolled back, that bureaucracy disappears with it. The most graphic example being fascist regimes, which eliminate both the union and the union members and that quote unquote bureaucracy. So bureaucracy is paradoxically a mark of success at the same time as it represents an institutionalization of the movement, which can lead to paralysis. But we have to take those two sides into consideration.
Thank you, Peter. There are a couple of questions, very interesting questions in the chat box. One is from Omar in Niger, and it's how can trade unions maintain their influence and mobilize to defend workers' rights in the face of military regime? I don't know, Hyman, Richard, whether you could apply somehow your scheme. So where would a union that is actually facing a military regime, what would it be facing in terms of your triangle? And there is another question from a comrade from Turkey, and it's about the yellow trade unions. Where would you put those in your conceptualization? And reference is made here to perhaps have another angle. So instead having a rectangular shape instead of a triangle. I think you see the comments on the chat box, but I let you to respond to these two questions to both of you. And I have Devin also, so we'll see how we do with the time. But first we get these questions. Who wants to go first?
Okay, I can bail the cats, huh? Well, I want to first salute the comrade from Niger. I have a good idea of what operating under a military dictatorship could be. I mean, without prejudice to some anti-imperialist steps that the, I mean, hype and real. I think because we had this long debate about how do we characterize the AES, but the fact of the matter is, I think democracy, not just in terms of form, but in content, is an essential element of what as working class we must fight for, you know. We've been there in a different context in Nigeria. I was more of a student union activist then, and also in the pro-democracy movement. And there are no easy answers to how to handle this. One, international solidarity is important, engagement, support, and things like that. But I mean, there's no easy way to it, especially in the specific context of the Sahel now, where you also have populist. These are not just they're not the sort of military dictatorships in Nigeria. Then they have populist roots. One can only extend solidarity to the extent we can, and I know there are people there. We have affiliates, and we get feedback. I know it is under very tight situations that they're operating. The question, the second question, I'm trying to. What was the second question? But I lost that. But I wanted to also point out that look with regards to Peter, one is not talking about doing away with the bureaucracy. It's just like what I was talking about, democracy in the broader system. Is that now the bureaucracy is much more powerful than rank and file. I'll give an example with Nigeria. When you had the restructuring of the trade unions in 1976 to 78, the general secretary, the conditions for being general secretary, you know, you had to be graduate, you had to be this, that. The money they get, they became more full-time. It became stronger, and it was clear it was an attempt at incorporation, you know, strengthening institutional power of the bureaucracy. And it was then that you have them living much larger and bigger than the rank and file worker. It's about being able to have, you know, a more democratic control, or at the very least influence of members on them. You can't do without, we cannot just wish them away. So yeah, I don't remember. I was trying to remember the other question, but maybe Richard might speak to that. And greetings, Devon. I see Comrade Devon there. All right.
It was about yellow trade unions, but yeah, we listened to Richard, and then Baba, you can add, of course.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I hope that Baba has answered the question about military dictatorships, because fortunately or otherwise, I have less direct experience. Clearly, it's an appalling set of problems that trade unions experience in the context of military dictatorship, and the sort of oppression which some trade unions experience in other countries is incomparable with what happens where trade unions are likely to be arrested and or shot. Let me address the question about yellow unions, and then I'll perhaps say something more about bureaucracy. Yellow unions exist and thrive primarily in contexts where there is no underlying pressure from below to have a union. I mean, one of the questions which Glue asks in the context of this whole program is, why do workers organise? And I would tend to say, in many respects, workers are already organised by capital. Employers require workers to be a collective. Trade unions are a form which they can impose independently on the organisation which has already been created by the very demands of the labour process. And it's another very complicated and detailed set of questions. In what contexts do workers collectively see a need to have an independent organisation, and what methods do they pursue in order to establish this? In some ways, yellow unions occur either when employers preempt the whole process by setting up their own quasi-trade unions before workers can organise them independently, or else it's a particular way of subverting the movement from below to set up independent organisation. And yellow unions face a certain dilemma. If you organise workers and get them to understand the value of collectivity, then they no longer automatically do what the employer wants, or they're vulnerable to rival unions, which are real trade unions rather than fake trade unions. And if one looks, certainly again, as I said at the outset, Western Europe is the part of the world I know best. In many countries, there have been yellow trade unions, which increasingly have turned into real trade unions, simply because workers, having been organised within them, then want them to act like proper trade unions and to take their interests to heart. So even within yellow unions, there can be a way of pushing from below and from within to make them a different sort of organisation. Whether one needs to have a square rather than a triangle, I mean, in many ways, it's an analytical tool, and I'm not terribly worried whether people think it should have 4 dimensions rather than 3. It's all, as I said at the outset, a form of simplification. But if I could end up by going back to the question of bureaucracy, bureaucracy, I always tend to say, is not simply a cadre of personnel. It's a social relationship. And it's a social relationship which in some ways is inevitable when you have organizations like trade unions whose function is defined, at least in part, as bargaining, as reaching agreements, as establishing Gramsci's industrial legality. And I think the key issue then has to be, for any trade union activist, what are the sources of the problems? How far are the problems resolvable? And by what means can we try to resolve them? And it seems to me understanding the process, as with so many things, has to be the starting point for effective responses. And in many ways, simply seeing bureaucracy as a particular caste of people with their own vested interests even though to an important extent, this may capture some of the reality. To see it solely in those terms is to underestimate the problem, and therefore to underestimate the sort of solutions we require.
Thank you very much, Richard. We are really beyond the time, but I'm going to get Devon because he traveled all the way from South Africa to Germany to make this question. So, Devon, over to you.
Thanks, Edlira. I'll try and be brief. I thought I'll just reintroduce the concept of social movement unionism into the conversation because no one has mentioned it. And as Baba Aye knows, when he did my class at the GLU many years ago, that's a concept I'm very fond of. And I suppose social movement unionism will, in your triangle, Richard, be located within the class pole, although I think I prefer the state market and society depiction, where your institutional arrangements will more probably belong to the state rather than in society, because society has more of a positive connotation. And these class alliances and broader class vision would be what I think is still a useful term, the social movement unionism. Now, and the key, one of the key issues about social movement unionism is what Baba Aye mentioned, and I think both of you are grappling with: bureaucracy on the one hand and democracy on the other. The iron law of oligarchy versus, well, the alleged iron law of democracy. And that's critical. This internal democratic expression within unions is critical for any emancipatory vision. And we see episodes of this here and there. And this is the tragedy of trade unionism. And as Edlira might know, I always provocatively say, oh, well, trade unions are useless. They're just no longer relevant for our times. And other times I say, well, okay, maybe they can be a force for counter-hegemonic mobilization. Maybe as long as they see their limitations, but also the ability to forge these broader alliances, which do happen on occasion in different parts of the world. But unfortunately, it's more on occasion than the dominant experience. When Peter Rosman spoke, I was just immediately thought about, the 2008 moment, 2007, 2008 financial crisis moment. And then Obama came into power, and General Motors was now temporarily state-owned. They bailed them out. And it wasn't the labor movement, it was someone like Michael Moore, a social commentator, who suggested, and I thought it was a brilliant suggestion, now is the moment then to retool General Motors and provide public transport for everyone. Where was the union voice in that? I didn't hear a single union, I may be wrong, but was there in the USA a single union voice saying, wow, that's an idea, let us take this up and campaign for it? Now you've got a relatively friendly new president, Obama, let's push him. Can anybody, okay, we run out of time now, but I would love that. That's a great research question for me. What were the unions, did anyone respond to a brilliant suggestion to really stretch the imagination of the workers, and something that they would love? I'm now in Germany, in Kassel, as a guest professor, and I'm here for 4 months, and the unions have won me free public transport for my period. Yeah, for me, but not for everyone. That's great, So they do serve some social purpose, but for their members. So I just think that we should retain this social movement union concept and continue to push for it, and push for within unions for them to broaden their vision and to have these active alliances, and it directly affects the question of the just transition. Do we just continue to unions continue to bemoan the fact, because that's what's happening in South Africa, that it's an unjust transition, it's not something we want, they're defensive, or do they proactively engage with this to assert a broader emancipatory vision around a truly just transition? So anyway, there's much more that one can say about this, but I thought I'd just throw that in and just to continue to punt the social movement union concept.
Yeah, thanks very much for bringing that, Devin. Actually, there was a question about social movement unionism and where would you place it actually in this in the conversation that we are having. So we are completely out of time. Perhaps I give you both Baba and Richard a possibility to respond to whatever points you think you want to pick up. There is also from Peter another fact, I think is referring to the same period that Devin, you were referring to, that did anyone respond to the fact that the government had substantial shares in the major banks? So over to you, Baba, would you want to go first, and then Richard, and then we wrap it up? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. With regards to the issue of the shares the government has in the banks and all that, I want to relate it to the broader issue of tripartism and the illusion of separation between employers and government or the state. The state is not neutral. It's on the same side with the capitalist. Of course, it has to have some semblance of neutrality in some sense. So that's why with the ILO, for example, I say that it's not that member states have 50% voting right, employers and the trade union workers group both have 25%. No, it's that the bosses, the class of the bosses have 75%, as against 25% for the working class. And that is how this thing is rigged again. So there's the need to see what is beyond the constrictions of the framing that they want us to see. With regards to this status issue of the bureaucracy, it's very important. But I'll give an example with Nigeria again. The plan of the government during that restructuring exercise I mentioned was to make the trade union so comfortable that they wouldn't fight. One of the things that was brought about was automatic check-off dues. Before then, I was working on my union's first general secretary's biography at a point, and it was like, if you didn't get there on the day the workers were collecting their wages, you might not even get your check-off dues, and then you can't pay yourself. So they felt that this was why they were more militant. But then you had an NLC that was a fighting NLC when it was born then. So there are contradictions in this. Anyway, considering time, what I would say, and going back to what I said then at that GLUE conference of 2010, it's not that the trade unions did not have anything to say in the wake of the global financial crisis. It was what the content of what they had to say was. It was that their demands were very limited. And what I said at that conference, because I reflected that earlier, the closest thing to the Great Depression was what happened in 2008, 2009. But they brought about totally different results. And in my view, it was like this. I captured it in this allegory. It's like that if you are in hell and you ask the devil for somewhere cooler in hell, it realizes that you are not very serious. But if you are in hell and you fight like hell to get out of hell, even if you don't succeed in getting out of hell, the devil will be ready to negotiate and give you a corner with air conditioning. I mean, that was the social compromise of the post-World War order. And what happened was rather the working class, the trade union movement was negotiating for global jobs pact and all these kind of what in Nigeria we call serere, cosmetics. We need to have a post-capitalist vision driving the demands and actions of the working class movement today for us to even be able to win the most minimal of significant reforms.
Thanks, Baba. Richard.
Thank you. I mean, I totally agree with that. One of the problems, I think, is that 2008, everyone said never again. Neoliberalism seemed to be totally discredited. And in the main, trade unions felt, okay, we don't need to fight neoliberalism anymore. They're going to have to find something better and more progressive. And of course, give it 6 months, and the world had changed again, and neoliberalism was back even stronger. And trade unions didn't have an agenda to deal with that. And in many ways, the roots of our problems is that precisely that there was not the sort of vision of an alternative that, as Baba says, that there did seem to be in the 1930s. Given time, just one brief comment on social movement unionism, which I think was a term invented by my late lamented old friend Peter Waterman. What I always argued was that there is not a distinct sort of trade unionism called social movement trade unionism. All trade unionism has some element of a social movement, just as all trade unionism has some element of a bureaucracy. And the key question is that how is the relationship between these different contradictory elements in this very curious and complicated phenomenon that is a trade union, that is a trade union movement. And I totally agree, we have to reconceive the social movement element within any sort of trade union if trade unions are to survive in a hostile world, because in many ways trade unions emerged, consolidated themselves because there was a vision which meant people were willing to sacrifice their time, their energy, in some cases their lives, because there was something there very powerful that they believed in. And one of the key questions today is how many trade unions still have that sort of motivating vision which underlies their organization? And if they don't any longer, how can they rediscover one? Because unless trade unions can rediscover this, then their future is rather grim. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you also for that final remark. Very, very important and also inspiring, and actually also back to generations of trade union activists to think about that sort of vision, inspiring vision that we can put for the labor movement, not just for the trade unions. And I think on the question of bureaucracy, we're going to have other conversations about trade unions' relationship to the struggle for democracy. And with that comes also the question, can organizations that are highly hierarchical or suffer from democracy themselves fight for the struggle for democracy in the society? So we will get into that conversation for the next webinar. I really want to thank very much Richard and Baba for excellent inputs, everyone for the great participation and questions. We will never resolve that, but we really hope to have this space for conversations, also for inspiring conversations in these very dark times, to start thinking about not just fighting authoritarianism, but also what's the world that we want to fight for. So thanks everyone. As Hien online tutor put in the chat, we are going to put the recordings in the course platform. So please do register in the course if you haven't done so, to also access the webinars, but also many, many interesting video lectures that speak to the questions that were raised today. Then I wish you all a very nice weekend, and a reminder that the weekend too was actually the fruit of the struggle of trade unions. So I don't think they will ever be irrelevant. We're just fighting to make them really speak to the challenges of our time. Thanks everyone, and see you in the other online events.